The International Agency for Research on Cancer declared that night shift work is a probable carcinogen, leading to lifestyle factors that can increase cancer risk and hormonal issues. The problem is over a quarter of the UK workforce work nights, and even more work irregular shifts. So, whether you're on nights, work irregular shifts, or you're a standard 9-to-5er, how can you manage your health in the best way possible? When I started in medicine, I was the last year, I think, that did 24-hour on-calls. So this meant that for a brief period of time in surgery, we would have a shift that would last for an entire 24-hour period. Now, this sounds terrible, as you'd imagine that it would be absolutely exhausting, but actually it was better than when you do a night shift work because you had control over your day. This meant you could kind of control your patients and settle them down for night. And if you were lucky, you'd catch a few hours sleep when it was dark and quiet. A couple of years in, and the European Working Hours Directive came into effect, which meant that you did your job during the day and then you hand it over to the night doctor who did exactly the same amount of work during his shift, and the cycle repeats. When we moved to this system, I actually found it was much harder to sleep during the day and regulate my body clock. Much worse than when I was doing a 24-hour on call. But this was over 20 years ago, and we now know that night shift work is associated with a range of health problems, something we don't really talk about, and I wonder if anyone who does night shifts knows just how damaging for our health it can be. I just want to double check that you've subscribed to the show because it really helps us continue these important conversations. Thanks. When we think about sleep and work, night shifts are where our biology and modern life collide. At the core of our physiology sits an internal clock, a form of genetically encoded timekeeper that runs on an approximate 24-hour cycle. And this is our circadian rhythm. It's based around the fact we were generally safer from predators at night, so we evolved to have our downtime then, where we can rest, recover, repair, and process our day's events. This entire daily rhythm is controlled by a tiny part of our brain called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which responds to light and dark signals to align physiological processes with the day-night cycle. Sleep itself is a dynamic physiological process, so it isn't just a switch that simply turns off and on. It's a complex cycle of stages, alternating roughly every 90 minutes between slow-wave restorative sleep and rapid eye movement, or REM sleep, where our neural activity resembles wakefulness. For men, sleep is deeply involved in endocrine regulation because testosterone synthesis follows a circadian pattern which is tightly coupled to your sleep, especially the deep slow-wave stages and the early night sleep phase. Lack of these stages directly reduces nocturnal testosterone release, and clinical studies demonstrate that even short-term sleep restriction, maybe as little as 5 nights of limited sleep, significantly lowers testosterone levels in healthy young men. So now, imagine what it's like when you have a newborn, or maybe you start binge watching Traitors when everyone else has gone to bed, or you become a night shift worker. The consequence of poor sleep is not limited to libido or athletic performance, however. Testosterone influences metabolic function, body composition, neuroplasticity, and even your immune regulation. If you want to die sooner, you consistently mess with your sleep. Interestingly, there is evidence from circadian research that light exposure alone, even if sleep duration remains unchanged, suppresses melatonin and shifts the internal clock in a manner that weakens your hormone rhythms. Light or daytime intensity during biological night, as experienced by most night shift workers, is a powerful way to cause long-term harm. Practically, night shift workers confront an environment where the brain's sleep promotion systems are out of sync with behavioral demands. And even if you think you're coping okay, the evidence is that still this has an adverse effect on health. Large, long-term studies show that people who work night shifts tend to die earlier than those who work a regular daytime hour. Evidence from the UK Biobank, which followed hundreds of thousands of adults, found that night shift workers have a higher risk of death from all causes, with the risk rising substantially for those people who do night shift work. The main cause is usually cardiovascular disease, so heart attacks or stroke. And interestingly, research also suggests that night shift workers have an accelerated biological aging, which of course reduces life expectancy. And this is likely due to chronic disruption of the circadian rhythm, sleep deprivation, downstream effects on your heart, metabolism, and cancer risk. To mitigate these effects, you need to do more than just sleep better in the day. Some strategies involve controlling light exposure, structuring sleep timing to coincide as closely as possible with these circadian signals, and protected, uninterrupted deep sleep windows. Night shift work may be unavoidable for many, but the chronic health costs, particularly to our testosterone and heart health, need to be a conversation we have, especially when considering the long-term health outcomes. I mentioned at the start that night shift work is now classed as a carcinogen and significantly adversely affects our health. Now, this isn't designed to scare anyone, but it really is true. And we have large amounts of evidence to show the adverse effects on long-term night shift work. Now, the big question you have to ask is, are people that are doing night shift work consented or discussed about these risks before they take on a job? When you start a job, you kind of just think, well, this is the job itself and I'll get into it. But I don't often think about the health risks associated. Now, if you were to say, I don't know, work down a mine somewhere, you might have your occupational health department say to you, guess what? Working in a mine could be associated with lung disease or other respiratory conditions in the future. Depends where you work. But I bet we don't have the same conversations about night shift. Now, whether that's somebody who's driving a truck or working as a surgeon at night or whatever you do, I think it's really important that employers do start to look at the effects of adverse sleep on their employees and how this could affect them in the long run. Because it may not stop you doing the job, but you should at least be aware of those risks moving forward, especially if you're going to do this long term. So we had a request from one listener who wanted us to talk about night shifts, who also described him or herself as being a gluttonous toad. I didn't use those words. But I appreciate that when you are on nights, it can be particularly challenging. And actually, sleep deprivation is associated with an increase in appetite. Now, there's lots of reasons for this, but for example, effects on cortisol, changes in testosterone, changes in metabolic rate. Have you ever noticed that when you're up really late, you do start to munch on more food and you do kind of crave carbs? So one thing you can do to avoid being the gluttonous toad we mentioned formerly is that you can meal prep, and it makes an enormous difference. Try to stick to regularity around your meals. Try to prepare those in advance as much as possible. And if you imagine what should you be consuming if you're on a sort of normal daytime regime, try and stick to that. So nothing bad is going to happen if you don't get to eat those extra few biscuits. You're not going to feel as great because you do crave those carbs, but actually you'll do yourself much, much better in the long run. So how do irregular shift patterns compare with those on permanent nights? Surely it's worse as you never get a chance to adapt and your circadian rhythm is all over the place. Well, the evidence suggests that is probably correct. Unlike consistent night work, where there is a form of adaptation over time, although we have to remember this is still worse than not doing night shifts at all, constantly changing your schedule prevents your body clock from ever establishing a stable phase of relationship with external sleep environments. So have you ever noticed, for example, if you get up at 7 every day, after a couple of weeks, it's easier to get up at 7 o'clock. That's because your body gets used to that as being the natural time it is that you should be getting up, and your circadian rhythm has adapted. At a molecular level, circadian rhythm arises from a coupled feedback loops within the clock genes, whose protein products rise and fall with remarkable precision. And these oscillators are present not only in the central clock of the brain, but they're in loads and loads of tissues in your body. So the liver, the pancreas, and of course your endocrine organs. So if you mess with your sleep cycle, your entire body is affected. This is why we often see high levels of cortisol in those people who do irregular sleep patterns. So cortisol is our stress hormone, and it follows our circadian rhythm really tightly. It rises early in the morning to promote wakefulness, and we often hear that cortisol is this really bad stress hormone for us. We don't want it, but you need it. You need it to get out of bed. You need it to get your blood pressure up. You need it to release glucose so you can move around. But in irregular sleep patterns, this causes circadian rhythm disruption, which elevates our baseline cortisol and destroys our usual peak and trough. And instead, you get a more consistent higher level of cortisol through your body, which never really goes down. So you never really relax. And in turn, this inhibits testosterone and causes a negative suppression loop. Poor sleep means low testosterone, which results in poor sleep, which results in low testosterone, and it goes round and round and round. One lesser appreciated aspect of disrupted sleep is the effect on sleep architecture. This is the proportion and sequence of slow wave and REM sleep cycles. Both stages have distinct neurobiological roles, with slow wave sleep being associated with things like growth hormone release and metabolic recovery, while REM sleep is needed for emotional sort of processing and memory consolidation. Basically, it's why you dream about the things you did in the day. So what can you do to minimize the health impacts of irregular sleep patterns? Well, basically, it requires you to anchor at least one consistent daily rhythm. So every day you need a fixed time when you can get some sleep, even if it's not your full amount. I'd love to say that if you just bought a light box or took some vitamin D, you'd be fine. But the evidence is that you need to stick to regular sleep times wherever possible. Other things you can do include timing of meals, controlled light exposure, and having a light box that does stream bright light just before it's time to get up. But these are really sort of coping strategies. So it's not a real long-term sustainable option. Have a suggestion for a Man Alive episode or thought about something said in this episode? Comment below and I read every one. Most of us have a conventional 9 to 5 work schedule, which is generally in alignment with our biological sleep clock. However, alignment alone does not guarantee quality sleep or optimal endocrine function. You have to remember that it's only really been the last few thousand years that we've had candlelight and more recently light bulbs to change our natural waking day. Before the advent of candlelit homes and workplaces, when the sun went down, it's time to go to sleep. And when the sun came up in the morning, it was time for us to wake, and off we would go and do our daily chores. As we've said already, generally, nighttime is a place of less physical threat, and therefore we've evolved in this time to be restful and let our bodies recover. But in the winter, for example, you might get up to 16 hours of darkness per day, at least in the UK, and obviously no healthy adult needs 16 hours of sleep. Therefore, what tended to happen was that you would go to sleep naturally and you'd have 2 sleep cycles. You go to bed when it gets dark, maybe have 3 or 4 hours of sleep, engage in your natural sleep cycles, then you'd wake up maybe at midnight or 1 a.m., do whatever jobs you need to do, meet some friends, have a drink, maybe have some sex, and then go back to sleep before the sun rose. And then you'd wake up when the sun comes up and you'd go back to your normal daily chores. We know this is the case not just from evolutionary biology, but also from evidence from medieval documentation that these practices often occurred. And it's only more recently that we kind of forced our biology to change. So we stay up much later than we should do, and we have one big long sleep cycle at night. Now, this isn't necessarily the best thing for us, but from a health perspective, I appreciate it's not great, but modern life doesn't always give us the best suggestions for our health. Sleep is structured into a repeating cycle of non-rapid eye movement and rapid eye movement REM sleep. Each full cycle lasts roughly 90 to 110 minutes and then repeats several times each night. So no rapid eye movement has 3 stages. Stage 1 is light sleep, and this is the initial transition from wakefulness where your brain activity and heart rate slow and you can be easily woken up. You know, when you're sort of just dozing off and then something makes a noise and then you can't back to sleep again. This is what happens in this stage. Stage 2 is when you get a deeper rest. It's marked by specific brainwave patterns that help memory consolidation and neural processing. And then you eventually move to stage 3, which is deep or slow wave sleep and is the most restorative phase. Crucially, you need it for physical recovery, immune function, and tissue repair. Once you've completed an NREM or non-eye movement sleep, you move to REM sleep, which is the stage characterized by rapid eye movements, heightened brain activity, which resembles wakefulness, and vivid dreaming. In REM sleep, muscles are temporarily paralyzed and the brain actively processes and consolidates memories. It helps support your learning and also helps you deal with those emotional stresses of the day. Each sleep stage serves a unique purpose. So light sleep eases the body into rest. Deeper, non-rapid eye movement sleep stages focus on physical restoration and memory stabilization, and REM sleep primarily benefits cognitive function and emotional health. If you manage to complete multiple uninterrupted cycles through these stages, you achieve your goal of a restful night, and with it, all the health benefits I mentioned above. But, as I also mentioned, modern life does not want us to sleep. We drink coffee too late in the day, we stare at our phones before bed, we check emails at all hours just in case, and we drink too much fluid so we have to get up and pee at night once we hit 40. With that in mind, here are top 5 things you can do to maximize your sleep and health. Keep a consistent schedule. Go to bed and wake up at the same time every day. Yes, even weekends, because this regulates your body clock better. As discussed already, your circadian rhythm likes regularity, so shaving off an hour at night is just as bad for you as having a line at the weekends. Create a wind-down routine. Spend the last 30 to 60 minutes before bedtime doing calming activities, reading, stretching, breathing, avoiding social media, and especially avoiding work emails, and maybe also avoiding Call of Duty. Optimize your sleep environment. Your bedroom is only there for 2 things, sleep and the obvious other thing you can do. Keep your bedroom cool, dark, and quiet. Your body likes it a little colder to sleep well. Be mindful of caffeine, alcohol, and late meals. Avoid caffeine after early afternoon, limit alcohol at night, and stop heavy eating 2 to 3 hours before bed. Basically, I tend to say no caffeine after sort of 4 p.m. Get daylight and move your body when you wake up. Even if it's just for a few minutes, try and get some natural sunlight and exercise regularly, but maybe just not too intensely just before you go to bed. One thing that's definitely worth touching on is the adverse effects of sleep deprivation on our mental health. You probably notice that if you wake up in the morning and you've had a bad night's sleep, you feel a bit grumpy. Well, imagine scaling this up to night after night of poor sleep. Now, this has real significant adverse effects on your body, both physically, as we've sort of touched on already, but also mentally. And in fact, there's some really interesting studies that show that if you consistently just start depriving people of good quality sleep longer and longer term, and you make those sleep hours shorter and shorter, you can really drive down mental health to the point where people actually start to hallucinate. This is not a joke, this is generally serious stuff. Sleep is so important that if you knock a couple of hours off day after day, hour after hour, months after month, this just keeps going. Eventually, it's going to have long-term adverse effects on your mental health. I know that if you implement this advice, you'll be able to have the confidence that you're doing all you can to protect your health. Remember, this video was suggested by one of our listeners, so do comment below any suggestions for topics you would like to see me cover in an upcoming episode. Thanks again for joining me on Man Alive. If you enjoyed this episode of Man Alive, you would love this one. Go on, press it. Click now, press it now.